The men who found it did not go inside, not at first. They stood at the edge of the trees for the better part of an hour, looking at a cabin that had no business still standing. It was small and low and grey with age, tucked into a fold of the Ozark Hills where no road had ever reached. And every window had been sealed, not shuttered, not boarded the way a man closes up a home he means to come back to. Sealed. Planks nailed in rows, a second layer crossing the first, and something packed thick behind the wood so that no light could pass in either direction. The door was barred from the inside, and whoever had done all of that sealing had never once come back out. People in these hills spoke about that cabin in low voices for more than 100 years. They called it by names that were not quite names. The shut house. Some called it the blind cabin, the one you do not point at after the sun goes down. For most of that time it was treated as a story told to keep children off the high ridges. Then a survey crew walked into that hollow one cold autumn and learned that the story had a floor and 4 walls and a roof of split shakes, and that the windows were exactly as the old people had always promised they would be. There is a photograph that the crew took that day, and if you have seen it, you do not forget it. A crooked little cabin in a clearing gone over to brush, and where the windows should be there is only wood, dark with weather and fitted so tight that the wall reads as solid. A house with the face of a house and no way to see out of it. That photograph is the reason most people first hear the story at all. What the photograph cannot show you is why anyone would ever do such a thing to a home. To understand why a family would wall themselves inside their own house, you have to understand the country that house sits in. The Ozark Hills are older than almost anything else on the continent. Worn down, soft and green over ages beyond any counting, cut through with hollows so deep the sun only reaches the bottom of them for an hour a day. People came up into that country in the early years looking for land that no one else wanted, and they found it waiting. Whole families settled ridges that appear on no map and answered to no county clerk. They were born and they married and they buried their own without a single record of it ever reaching the outside world. The hills kept them, and now and then the hills kept their reasons too. There is a thing the old families say about that particular country, said carefully and only once and never explained. The hollows in the deep Ozarks were not empty when the first settlers came up into them. There were foundations already there, stone laid in courses that no one living had laid, walls half sunk into the hillside, and here and there a cabin already old and already blind, its windows already sealed by hands that had gone to dust long before. The settlers did not build the first of the blind houses. They only learned, the hard way, why the blind houses were built, and then they learned to build their own. The cabin stood at the head of a hollow that the locals never gave a proper name. The crew reached it by following a creek that ran the wrong way, uphill against every rule that water is supposed to obey, until the trees closed over their heads, and the light went the colour of an old copper penny. What they found in the clearing was a home that someone had loved once. A stone chimney laid course by careful hands, the low grey ghost of a garden fence, and the windows, 4 of them, each one buried under so many layers of plank and packed clay that from across the clearing the whole cabin looked as though it had been built without any eyes at all. None of the crew spoke much at all on the long walk back down, and before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker, and I realised a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of what that family sealed inside their own walls, the exact order they nailed the boards, the material they packed behind the wood, the surveyor's own written description of what waited on the other side of that door. I put it all into a written document. It's linked below and the QR code is on your screen. Now let's continue. The crew filed their report, and the report used careful, bloodless words, an abandoned structure, evidence of the deliberate closure of all openings, cause undetermined. But the men who signed that page went home to towns at the foot of those hills, and in those towns lived people whose grandparents had grown up hearing about exactly this, because the shut house at the head of the hollow was not the only one of its kind. It was only the one that had lasted. Ask an old family in the deep Ozarks about the blind houses, and most of them will tell you plainly that they never heard of any such thing. Ask again later, when the porch has gone dark and the talk has fallen quiet, and once in a while you get a different answer. There were cabins, they will say, built by folk who came up into these hills long before anyone now living. And some of those cabins had their windows shut in the very same way. Not against the winter cold, not against thieves, since there was nothing up there worth the stealing and no one to do it. They were shut against the nights, against whatever it was that used to come to the glass once the light was gone. There was another one, they say, 3 hollows over, that a timber company stumbled onto in the years between the wars, a low grey cabin just the same sealed windows, though that one had been done in fieldstone and mortar rather than plank. The timbermen, being practical and short on patience for hill stories, broke open one of the walls to see what a family would go to such trouble to hide. They did not find treasure, and they did not find bodies. They found a single chair set in the middle of the floor, turned to face the window they had just broken open, and the boards of that floor worn bare in a track around it, as though someone had circled that chair for years. The company pulled its crew off the ridge inside the week and logged somewhere else. No report, if there ever was one, has ever turned up. The story, in the shape the old people give it, is simple, and it is worse for being simple. In certain hollows, on certain nights, something comes to the windows. It does not knock. It does not try the door or test the latch. Instead, it stands at the glass and it waits. And what it waits for is to be seen, to be looked at directly by a living person from the warm side of the window. The families who understood this handed one rule down through the generations, like a deed to the land. You do not look, no matter what shape it has taken at the window, no matter whose voice comes through the wall in the dark. You do not walk to the glass, and you do not look. The families who kept the rule the longest were the ones who could describe in flat and unwilling detail what came to the window and what it did. It arrived wearing the sound of someone you had lost, a husband gone under the river ice 2 winters back, a daughter carried off by the fever, sometimes a mother 30 years in the ground. It stood at the sealed wall, and it spoke in that borrowed voice, patient and warm and terribly reasonable, and it asked only for the smallest thing. A gap, a crack in the boards, one eye at the glass, just to see your face again, just to know that you were well. And the whole horror of it was how badly. On a long dark night in a snowbound house, a grieving person wanted to give it exactly what it asked for. And for the families who could not trust themselves or their children to keep that rule through a long winter, there was only one thing left to do. You took the glass away, you took away the temptation of it entirely. Then you sealed every window in the house, plank over plank and clay behind, so that on the nights it came there was nothing to look through and no way at all to answer it. The thing at the wall could stand out there in the dark until the sun came up, and it would find no eyes inside, willing to meet its own. Every seal in the shut house had to be renewed. That was the part the old families never forgot, and outsiders never understood. Wood shrinks and cracks and pulls its own nails loose over the seasons, and a single hairline gap in a long wall was enough. So the men of each generation went over every window at the end of the harvest, tapping, testing, driving fresh planks over the old ones. A blind cabin was not sealed once. It was sealed again and again, year upon year, by people who never once let themselves forget what a single open seam in the dark could cost them. The layers the crew later counted, plank on plank on plank, were not the work of one frightened night. They were the count of every winter that family had survived. The rule was never really about a monster at the window, though. The old people understood something colder than that. A plank does not stop a thing that can wear your dead mother's voice. Boards and clay were never a wall against the visitor at all. They were a wall against yourself, against the part of you that would rise from a warm bed at 3 a.m, on the 4th night of that voice, and cross a cold floor to the window, because you had finally, quietly decided that you simply had to know. The seal took the choice out of your hands. In a country where the nights were that long and the grief was that heavy, taking the choice away was the only mercy that anyone up there knew how to give. Before we move on to what happened the last winter that cabin was lived in, stop for a second. What you just heard about the rule the old families kept is the part that changes everything, but it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the full account the crew recorded. The blind houses, the rule of the glass, it's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it and then come back, because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. The last family to live in the shut house kept the rule for longer than most. 3 generations of them held that ridge, and the oldest among them, a grandfather already stooped and half blind by the end, was the one who carried the old knowledge. He was the one who checked the seals each fall before the snow came. He was the one who reminded the little ones over and over again that the sounds at the wall in winter were never anyone they knew, no matter how much they sounded like it. Then came a winter that buried the whole hollow. The snow lay so deep and so long that the family did not see another living soul from the first hard freeze until the thaw. And somewhere in the long middle of that winter, on one of the very nights the grandfather had spent his whole life warning about, a child in that cabin heard a voice at the wall. A voice that was gentle and familiar and asked so softly to be let a single look inside. And the child, who had heard the rule 1,000 times but had never once been given a reason a child could truly believe, went quiet and listened, and at last went looking for a gap in the boards. The others in the house woke to the sound of the boards, a small sound, wood easing away from wood the way a single plank gives when careful fingers work it loose in the dark. By the time the grandfather reached the front room, the child was already at the wall, already crouched with one eye pressed to a thin new gap in the seal, already gone still and quiet in a way that no scolding had ever once managed. Whatever was on the other side of that gap had been seen, and once a thing like that has been looked at, the old people say the looking can never be taken back. It has your face now, and it knows the way in. What the grandfather did after that, he did with a calm that must have frightened the others more than any screaming could have. He did not try to run for the valley through 6 feet of snow with the little ones in tow. He knew there was no outrunning a thing that had already been answered. Instead, he took up his hammer and the last of the planks he had cut and cured for exactly this, and he sealed the house one final time from the inside, every board doubled and every seam packed tight. Not to keep the thing out, it was far too late in the season for that. He sealed the house to keep what was now inside it from ever reaching the valley below. No one in the towns at the foot of the hills ever saw that family again. When the snow finally went, no smoke rose from the chimney at the head of the hollow. The trails up were grown over by summer, and the people who might have gone looking chose, in the way these hill people always chose, not to. The shut house was left to do whatever a shut house does when there is no one left to open it. And for the better part of a century, no one did. Every so often, over the years, someone with more nerve than sense would go looking for the shut house on purpose. Trappers, then hunters, then the kind of young men who dare each other up onto the ridges after dark. Most found nothing but trees, and came home to admit a little too loudly that the whole thing was only ever an old story. A few found the hollow. Fewer came back down able to say what they had seen there. And there is a short, quiet list of names kept in the memory of the towns at the foot of the hills, of the ones who went up looking for the blind cabin, and simply never came down at all. The hills did with them what the hills have always done. They closed over the place where those men had been, slowly and completely, and left no record. So when the crew pried loose the first of those inner boards in the autumn light, they did it without knowing any of this. They only knew they had found something that a great deal of effort had once been spent on closing. The nails came out slow and rusted. Behind the planks was the packed clay, and behind the clay was another wall of plank, and it was on the inner face of those innermost boards, the ones that had faced the empty rooms, that the crew found the marks. Long grooves worn into the wood at the height a standing person might reach towards a window, not clawed in panic, worn smooth and deep the way stone is worn by slow water, as though something had stood at that sealed window from the inside for a very, very long time, feeling patiently for the gap that the grandfather had made certain would never be there. Inside, the cabin was almost tidy. That was the detail that stayed with the crew the longest, the one none of them ever put in the report. The table was set, cups still sat on the shelf, a child's carved animals were lined along the sill of the front room window facing inward, turned deliberately away from the sealed boards as though even the toys had been taught the rule. There was no sign of a struggle anywhere in those rooms. Whatever happened in the shut house at the end had happened without a fight, in a home that had gone on keeping itself in order right up until the day it went quiet. The grandfather had not sealed a ruin. He had sealed a home with everything still in its place, and then he had stayed inside it. The stranger part came later, when the crew tried to put a name to the family and the hollow. There was no name to find. No deed, no census line, no grave marker, no county record of anyone ever having lived at the head of that creek that runs uphill. It was as though the hollow and everyone in it had been quietly lifted out of the written history of the region and set to one side. The old people at the foot of the hills were not surprised by this in the least. Those blind houses, they will tell you, are never in the records. The hills do not hand them over. Whatever the shut cabins were built to hold, the country around them seems to close over the memory the same way it closes over the trails, slowly and completely, and on purpose. The blind cabin is not the only place in those hills that seems to have been erased on purpose. Old surveyors used to speak quietly of hollows that appeared on one year's map and were simply gone from the next. Creeks that changed the direction of their flow between one visit and another. A whole settlement by one account that a mail rider passed through in the spring and could not find again by the fall, and no one he asked at the foot of the hills would admit it had ever stood at all. The people who live longest in that country learn not to press on these things. They have a saying for it, worn smooth from long use. The hills keep what the hills seal, and they do not give it back for the asking. The crew resealed the cabin before they left. Every man among them who was asked why gave a different reason, and not one of the reasons was any good, and every one of them did it anyway. They put the boards back, and they packed the clay, and they barred the door, and they walked out of that hollow following the creek back down into country that behaved the way country is supposed to. When two of them went back the following spring with better equipment and every intention of doing a proper study, they could not find the hollow again. The creek was there. It ran the right direction now, and the head of it opened onto nothing but trees. Whatever the truth of the shut house is, the shape of the story never changes in the telling, and that steadiness is its own kind of warning. It is not a tale that grows in the retelling the way most hill stories do. There are no new details, no rival versions, no teller who claims his own grandfather saw more than the last one did. There is only the cabin, and the 4 sealed windows, and the one rule, handed down flat and unadorned by people who plainly wish they had never had to learn it at all. A story that will not embellish itself is a story that the people telling it are still on some level afraid of, and in the deep Ozarks they are still afraid of this one. There is a version of this story where the shut house is only ever a warning, a way the old people had of teaching their children to fear the dark and stay indoors through the worst of the winter. That may be all it ever was. But the windows are still sealed, the grooves are still worn deep into the inner boards, and no one who has stood in that clearing has ever quite managed to convince themselves all the way through that the rule was only ever a story. The shut house still stands somewhere at the top of a hollow that most maps will not admit exists. Its windows are sealed, as they have been sealed for longer than anyone can prove, plank over clay over plank. 4 blind eyes turned out at a dark that still comes. The old families are almost all gone now, and the rule they kept is very nearly gone with them. But it was never a complicated rule, and it has never once changed. On the wrong night, in the wrong hollow, something may still come to stand at the glass and wait to be seen. And the only people who ever lived long enough to teach anyone else were the ones who understood all the way down that no matter what waits on the other side of that window, you do not go to the glass, and you do not look.